A homeless mother gave her only blanket to a shivering little girl, unaware the girl's father was a reclusive, grief-stricken billionaire CEO. "Daddy, her baby is freezing." The biting cold hammered down on the city streets like 1,000 frozen fists, relentless and wild. Elara pulled the thin, threadbare blanket tighter around the precious bundle in her arms, a futile gesture against the wind that splintered through the alleyway, carrying with it the scent of rain and despair. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the grime-slicked brick walls for a split second before darkness swallowed everything whole, leaving only the ghost of her own pale, gaunt face reflected in a murky puddle. She was so very tired. Her son, Leo, whimpered softly in his sleep, his tiny body trembling against hers, his breath a fragile puff of white in the fragile air. He was her whole world, the single, pure flame against the crushing weight of her shattered life. Just 6 months ago, she had a husband, a home, a future that shimmered with gentle promise. Now, she had only the worn fabric of her memories and the unbearable weight of a love that had nowhere to go. The silence deepened. It was a hollow, aching silence, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the relentless pounding of her own weary heart. Her husband, Daniel, had been the sun in her sky, his laughter a warm, golden glow that made everything right. His sudden death in a car accident had been a seismic shock, a brutal severing that left her world colorless and brittle. But the cruelty that followed was a different kind of pain, a slow, deliberate poison administered by the one person who should have offered comfort, her mother-in-law, Beatrice Thorne. Beatrice had always viewed Elara with a cold, polished disdain, seeing her as an unworthy addition to their stately family, a simple girl who had somehow ensnared her precious son. After Daniel's death, that disdain curdled into a raw, venomous hatred. The eviction notice had been served on a crisp, sunny morning, the legal jargon feeling like a slap across the face. "You do not belong here," Beatrice had hissed, her eyes gleaming with a triumphant cruelty as Elara stood on the polished marble steps of the home she had shared with Daniel, clutching a box of her few belongings and her infant son. "You are nothing but a reminder of my loss, a parasite who took my son and now wants my fortune." The words had echoed in the sterile silence of the grand foyer, each syllable a shard of glass in Elara's heart. She had tried to reason, to appeal to the memory of the son they both loved, but Beatrice was a fortress of bitterness. She was gone. Elara had nowhere to go. Her own parents were long past, and the friends she'd had were Daniel's friends, their loyalties now firmly aligned with the commanding matriarch who held the family purse strings. So she had walked away, her quiet dignity her only shield against the shame and the terror that threatened to consume her. For weeks, she had drifted through the city's unforgiving arteries, selling her wedding ring for a few nights in a cheap motel, then her husband's watch for formula and diapers. Now, there was nothing left to sell. There was only the biting cold and the desperate, unspoken prayer that Leo would not feel the full extent of their fall. He was just a baby, an innocent soul wrapped in a world of hardship. She kissed his soft, cool forehead, inhaling his sweet, milky scent. It was the only thing that felt real. Her heart thudded with a slow, heavy rhythm, a drumbeat of quiet resolve. She would not break. For him, she would be unbreakable. She had to be. That same evening, across the city in a manicured park where amber-hued lamps cast a golden glow upon the damp pathways, Alistair Vance walked in a heavy fog of his own making. The pounding rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, each drop clinging to the leaves of the great oak trees like 1,000 tiny, glistening tears, mirroring the unspoken grief that had become his constant companion. He held his daughter Lily's small hand, his grip a little too tight, the only anchor in the cavernous emptiness that his life had become since Amelia was taken from him. He froze. A year. It had been 1 year to the day since the world had splintered, since the sterile silence of a hospital room had replaced the sound of his wife's laughter. He was the CEO of a global empire, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth, whose decisions could shift markets and build skylines. But in this park, under the flickering light of the old-fashioned lamps, he was just a man. A hollow man. He wore simple, unassuming clothes, a dark coat, worn jeans, a desperate attempt to shed the gleaming armor of his public life and feel something, anything, real. He came here because Amelia had loved this park, had loved the way the city lights shimmered through the trees after a storm. But the memories that were meant to be a comfort were now just ghosts that haunted the periphery of his vision. Lily, his precious, 5-year-old daughter, was the only fragment of Amelia's light he had left. She skipped ahead, her bright yellow raincoat a stark splash of color against the muted blues and grays of the evening. "Daddy, look!" "A puddle," she squealed, her voice a pure, innocent chime in the soft hush. He managed a weak smile, a trembling imitation of the real thing. "Be careful, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He saw the world through a thick pane of glass, everything muted and distant. He was surrounded by luxury, by ornate furniture and crisp suits and sleek cars, but it all felt like a movie set for a life someone else was supposed to be living. A sharp gust of wind swept through the park, and Lily shivered, her small shoulders hunching. "Daddy, I'm cold," she said, her voice small. His chest tightened. He had forgotten her scarf. A simple, fatherly duty, and he had failed. Guilt, sharp and familiar, pierced through the fog of his grief. He knelt down, pulling her close, trying to shield her with his own body, but the wind was relentless. It was then that he saw her. A woman sitting on a nearby bench, so still she seemed part of the shadows. She was holding a baby, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her face, illuminated for a moment by a passing car's headlights, was etched with a weariness that seemed ancient, yet her eyes, fixed on his shivering daughter, held a steady, unwavering light. It was Alara. She saw the little girl, the bright yellow coat, the way she trembled in her father's arms. She saw the father's pained expression, the flicker of helplessness in his eyes. Her heart, already so heavy, felt a pang of profound, maternal empathy. It was a raw, undeniable instinct. She looked down at Leo, sleeping soundly against her chest, his own small body cocooned in the only blanket they owned. It was a worn, faded quilt, a gift from her own mother years ago, the last tangible piece of her past. A moment of internal hesitation, a desperate calculation of survival. Without it, the night would be unbearable. But then she looked back at the little girl, whose teeth were now chattering, whose small face was pale in the dim light. The hesitation vanished, swept away by a wave of pure, selfless compassion. She stood up, her movements slow and dignified, and walked towards them. Alistair watched her approach, a flicker of caution stirring within him. But there was no threat in her posture, only a quiet, gentle purpose. She stopped in front of them, her gaze soft. "Your daughter," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "she is very cold." Before Alistair could respond, before he could even process the sincerity in her tired eyes, she was carefully unwrapping the blanket from her own child. She folded it with a tender reverence and held it out. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Take this." For her, Alistair stared at the offered blanket. It was old, the fabric thin, the colors faded from countless washings. But in that moment, it felt more valuable than anything in his polished, cavernous vault. He was stunned into silence. He saw the sacrifice in the gesture, the sheer, uncalculated goodness of it. In his world, every action was transactional, every kindness a calculated investment. This was something else entirely. It was sacred. "I can't," he finally managed to say, his voice thick. "Your baby, he is warm enough with me," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "She needs it more right now." She pushed the blanket into his hands. The fabric was surprisingly soft, and for a wild, inexplicable second, he felt a warmth spread from it through his entire body, chasing away a year's worth of biting cold from his soul. He reached for his wallet, a reflexive gesture of his world. "Let me pay you." "Please." A shadow of pain crossed her face, so fleeting he almost missed it. "No," she said softly. "It is not for sale." She gave a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her haunted eyes, then turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the park before he could say another word, before he could ask her name. He was left standing in the drizzle, holding a stranger's worn blanket, the scent of lavender and something indefinably gentle clinging to the fabric. A profound, life-altering impact. For the first time in a year, Alistair Vance felt a crack in the ice around his heart. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. Lily was warm. The night deepened, growing colder as the last vestiges of the storm moved on, leaving behind a sky of polished, indifferent stars. For Ilara, the absence of the blanket was an immediate and brutal reality. She huddled deeper into the recessed doorway of a closed shop, curling her body around Leo, trying to create a pocket of warmth with her own dwindling heat. The concrete was unforgiving, leaching the life from her, and a deep, trembling chill set into her bones. She didn't regret her decision. Seeing the relief on that little girl's face, the way she had clutched the soft fabric to her cheek, had been a momentary balm to her own aching soul. It was a small act of control in a life that had spun completely out of it, a declaration that even with nothing, she could still give something. But now, in the sterile silence of the sleeping city, fear began to creep in, a cold, insidious tendril wrapping around her heart. Leo stirred, his small body shivering violently against hers. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in her throat. She began to rock him, humming a lullaby her own mother used to sing, the notes fragile and thin in the vast, empty street. Each verse was a prayer, a desperate plea to a universe that seemed to have forgotten them. She pressed her lips to his forehead, feeling the alarming coldness of his skin. This was no longer just about her own suffering. This was about her son. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, desperate sound she quickly stifled. She could not fall apart. Not now. Meanwhile, miles away, Alistair Vance returned to his stately mansion, a palace of gleaming surfaces and deep shadows that had long ago ceased to feel like a home. It was a museum of his grief, every polished floorboard echoing with the absence of Amelia's footsteps, every ornate room filled with a deafening, cavernous silence. He dismissed the waiting staff with a wave of his hand and walked into his vast, impeccable study. He laid the worn blanket across the expanse of his polished mahogany desk. Under the soft, amber hue of his desk lamp, the simple object seemed to glow with an inner light, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated luxury surrounding it. It was an artifact from another world, a world of sincere emotion and selfless acts he had forgotten existed. He ran a hand over the soft, threadbare fabric, and a jolt went through him. It was the first thing he had willingly touched in months that didn't feel cold and dead. The scent of lavender, faint but persistent, filled his senses, and with it came an image of the woman's face, her hollow cheeks, her worn clothes, but most of all, her steady, unflinching eyes. Eyes that held so much pain, yet offered so much kindness. A powerful, undeniable sense of purpose began to solidify within him, displacing the heavy fog of his grief. This woman, this stranger, had given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a flicker of connection, a spark of hope. She had given her only source of warmth to his child without a second thought. The sheer purity of the act was a revelation. He sat down in his leather chair, the worn blanket before him like a sacred text. He would not let this go. He would not allow such goodness to be swallowed by the cold indifference of the world. He picked up his phone, his movements crisp and decisive for the first time in a year. He dialed the head of his personal security, a man accustomed to tracking corporate spies and phantom stock traders. "Mark," Alistair said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that had been absent for too long. "I have a job for you. It's the most important one I've ever given you." He described the woman, the park, the baby, his words precise and urgent. "Find her," he commanded. "I want to know everything. But you are to be discreet. She is not to be alarmed or approached. Just find her." Total silence. He hung up the phone, his gaze returning to the blanket. He knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that finding this woman was now inextricably linked to finding his own way back to the world of the living. She had saved his daughter from the cold. Now, He would save her from whatever darkness had put her on that park bench in the first place. It was a promise. A sacred vow made to a ghost in the park and to the shattered pieces of his own heart. Mark and his team were ruthlessly efficient. Using park security footage and facial recognition software, they had a name within hours, Elara Vance. The irony of the shared surname was not lost on Alastair. It felt like a strange twist of fate. The report that landed on his desk the next morning was a bleak, heartbreaking chronicle of her life's recent collapse. It detailed the death of her husband, Daniel, and the subsequent, cruel eviction by her mother-in-law, Beatrice Thorne. It listed her failed attempts to find work, the depletion of her savings, and her current status, homeless, with a 6-month-old infant. Each sentence was a blow, fueling the cold, protective anger that was now burning away the last remnants of his apathy. He had his team track her movements in real time. He watched from a distance, through the sterile lens of a surveillance feed on his tablet, as she was turned away from 3 different overcrowded shelters, her face a mask of quiet, dignified desperation. He saw her trying to clean herself and Leo in the restroom of a public library, her movements gentle and loving despite the grim surroundings. He saw her share the last of a small piece of bread with a stray dog. The sight of her unwavering grace in the face of such profound hardship was almost more than he could bear. It solidified his resolve. He would not simply swoop in and offer her charity, her dignity was too palpable, too precious. To do so would be to reduce her sacred act of kindness to a simple transaction, and he refused to tarnish it. The intervention had to be as gentle and anonymous as her own gift had been. He made another call, this time to the director of a small, privately funded family shelter he had supported in the past, a place called The Haven. His instructions were clear and non-negotiable. An immediate, substantial, and anonymous donation was being wired to them. With that donation, they were to open a newly available, private family suite. Furthermore, a shelter outreach worker was to go to a specific location, the library where Elara was currently seeking refuge from the cold, and discover a mother and child in need, offering them this specific room. There was to be no mention of a benefactor. It was to be presented as a stroke of miraculous good fortune. For Elara, the intervention felt exactly like that, a miracle. She was sitting in a quiet corner of the library, Leo asleep in her lap, the warmth of the building a temporary paradise. She was reading a children's book, her voice a soft murmur, when a kind-faced woman approached her. The woman, a social worker from the Haven, spoke in gentle tones, explaining that a private room had just unexpectedly become available. Elara was hesitant, conditioned by days of rejection, but the woman's sincere eyes persuaded her. A few hours later, she stepped into a small, clean, and wonderfully warm room. There was a proper crib for Leo, a soft bed for her, and an adjoining private bathroom. On the small table, there was a thermos of hot soup, fresh bread, and a bag filled with new diapers, formula, and soft baby clothes. Elara's knees buckled. She sank onto the bed, pulling Leo close, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to weep. They were tears of raw, cathartic relief, a flood of gratitude so profound it was painful. She didn't know who was responsible for this incredible kindness, what angel had looked down and seen her suffering. She simply accepted it as a sign that perhaps the universe had not forgotten her after all. She bathed Leo in the warm, clean sink, his happy gurgles echoing in the small, safe space. She dressed him in a soft new sleeper and laid him in the crib, where he immediately fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. For the first time in a long time, he was not trembling from the cold. Elara ate the soup, each spoonful a warm, life-affirming gift. She felt the tension drain from her shoulders, the gnawing anxiety in her stomach replaced by a fragile, burgeoning sense of hope. She was safe. Her baby was safe. It was all that mattered. Alastair gave her a week to settle in, a week to feel the ground firm up beneath her feet again. He received daily updates from the shelter director, discreet reports on her progress. Elara was quiet, respectful, and deeply grateful, spending her days caring for Leo and helping with chores around the shelter. She never asked questions about her good fortune, simply accepting it with the same quiet grace she displayed in all things. Finally, he knew he had to see her again, to speak with her, to understand the woman who had inadvertently pulled him back from the brink. He couldn't arrive as Alistair Vance, the billionaire benefactor. He had to meet her on equal footing, as a human being. He dressed again in his simple, unassuming clothes and drove himself to the shelter, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He introduced himself to the director as Al, a potential volunteer looking to help out, a man with some time on his hands after a personal loss. The director, well briefed, led him to the shelter's common room. And there she was. She was sitting in a worn armchair near a window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, a book open in her lap. Leo was on a playmat at her feet, happily batting at a colorful rattle. She looked different than she had in the park. The hollows in her cheeks were less pronounced, and the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a soft, weary tranquility. She looked up as he entered, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "You," she said, her voice a soft gasp. "From the park. Your little girl. Is she all right?" Her first thought was for his child. The sincerity of it struck him once again. "She's wonderful," Alistair said, his voice softer than he intended. "Thanks to you. I never got to thank you properly," he gestured to the empty chair opposite her. "May I?" She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. He sat, and for a moment, they were enveloped in a comfortable silence. He didn't know where to begin. He had rehearsed a dozen different conversations, but now, faced with her gentle presence, all the carefully constructed words vanished. He simply told her his name was Al, and that he was glad to see she and her son had found a safe place. Over the next few days, Al became a regular presence at the Haven. He would help in the kitchen, play with the children in the common room, or simply sit and talk with Alara while Leo napped. He kept his identity a carefully guarded secret, presenting himself as a man adrift in his own grief, a widower trying to find a new purpose. It was this shared vulnerability that allowed their connection to deepen. They never spoke of the blanket again, but it was an unspoken foundation between them, a symbol of the goodness he had seen in her and the kindness she had shown him. One evening, after the shelter had settled into a soft hush, he found her in the communal kitchen, staring into a cup of cooling tea, a profound sadness in her eyes. It was time for the confession scene. He quietly made 2 fresh cups of tea and set one down in front of her. "A long day?" he asked gently. She looked up, her eyes glistening under the dim light. She gave him a small, watery smile. "A long life," she whispered. And then, in the quiet intimacy of the late-night kitchen, she began to talk. She told him about Daniel, about their love, about the future they had planned. She spoke of his sudden death, the raw, splintering pain of it. And then, her voice trembling with a quiet, dignified anger, she told him about Beatrice Thorne, about the cruelty and the eviction, about being cast out with a newborn baby. She laid her story bare, not with self-pity, but with a simple, heartbreaking honesty. Alistair listened. He listened with an unwavering, steady intensity that made her feel, for the first time since Daniel's death, completely and truly seen. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply listened, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in the storm of her memories. When she finished, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, he reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. A simple, empathetic gesture. "I'm so sorry, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was entirely genuine. "No one should have to endure that." The warmth of his hand was steady and safe. She didn't pull away. Then, it was his turn. He reciprocated, forging a bond over their shared grief. He told her about Amelia, his Amelia. He spoke of her vibrant spirit, her infectious laughter, the way she had filled every corner of his life with light and color. He described the cavernous emptiness she had left behind, the suffocating weight of a world without her. He confessed his own profound loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life, a father struggling to connect with his own daughter through a fog of pain. He didn't mention his wealth or his company, he spoke only of the raw, universal language of loss. They were just two broken people, sitting in a shelter kitchen in the middle of the night, finding solace in the shared geography of their sorrows. The bond between them solidified, no longer just about a single act of kindness, but about a deep, mutual understanding of the fragility and preciousness of love. The scene ended with that gentle, non-romantic physical contact, his hand still covering hers, a silent promise of safety and a profound, unspoken connection. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that he would do anything to protect this woman and her child from ever feeling that cold desperation again. He was beginning to fall in love. With Alistair's discreet help, Ilara's life began to find a new, fragile rhythm. The shelter director, citing a new community partnership program, helped her secure a part-time job as a waitress at a charming, upscale cafe called the Gilded Spoon. It was a place known for its polished marble countertops and the amber hue of its lighting, a small haven of warmth and civility. For Ilara, it was a lifeline. Earning her own money, however modest, was a vital step in reclaiming her independence. She worked hard, her movements efficient and her smile, though still tinged with weariness, sincere and gentle. She saved every dollar she could, dreaming of one day having a small apartment for herself and Leo. Alistair, still known to her only as Al, was a quiet, steady presence in her life. He would often come by the cafe for coffee, sitting at a small table in the corner, his presence a comforting reassurance. They spoke of simple things, Leo's first tooth, Lily's latest drawing, the changing seasons. Their bond deepened with each quiet conversation, a tender, unspoken affection growing in the space between them. He was waiting for the right moment to tell her the truth, but he was terrified that the revelation of his immense wealth would shatter the pure, simple connection they had built. He wanted her to choose him, not his fortune. The day of the climax arrived like any other, a crisp autumn afternoon with golden sunlight slanting through the cafe's large windows. The soft hush of the room was filled with the quiet clink of porcelain and the low murmur of conversation. Ilara was moving gracefully between tables, a tray balanced expertly in her hand, when the small bell above the door chimed. Her heart froze. Standing in the doorway, framed like a villain in a play, was Beatrice Thorne. She was flanked by two of her wealthy, impeccably dressed friends, her face a mask of cold, cruel surprise as her eyes landed on Ilara. The air in the cafe crackled, the pleasant atmosphere instantly curdling. Beatrice's lips curled into a venomous sneer. She glided towards the counter, her movements commanding and imperious, drawing the attention of every patron in the room. She was here to create a scene of intense public humiliation, to perform a final, brutal act of cruelty. Well, Beatrice's voice was loud, slicing through the quiet cafe. Look what we have here. Ilara. I must say, this is a step up from the gutter, but only just, her friends tittered, their eyes filled with scorn. Ilara stood frozen, the tray in her hands trembling slightly. She remained dignified, her chin held high, but a pale flush of shame crept up her neck. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of her tears. Beatrice, Ilara said, her voice a low, steady whisper. Please. Not here. This was precisely the reaction Beatrice wanted. The public stage was set. Not here, she scoffed, her voice dripping with theatrical pity. Where else should we discuss your spectacular failure? My son must be turning in his grave, knowing the woman who carries his name is slinging coffee for pocket change. You were always a gold digger, but it seems you weren't even very good at that. The accusations were poison darts, each one finding its mark. The other patrons were now staring openly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Ilara winced, her resolve beginning to splinter under the relentless, public assault. You are an unfit mother, Beatrice continued, her voice rising in pitch, dragging my grandchild through filth and poverty. You are a disgrace to my son's memory, a stain on our family, to punctuate her vicious monologue, she gestured dismissively and, accidentally, knocked the tray from Alara's hands. Cups and saucers shattered on the polished floor, the sound echoing the shattering of Alara's composure. She was visibly overwhelmed. A sharp gasp went through the room. At that exact moment, the bell above the door chimed again. A dramatic entrance. Alistair walked in. He had arranged to meet Alara for coffee, as, he took in the scene in an instant, Alara, pale and trembling amidst the broken porcelain, Beatrice, triumphant and cruel, the silent, staring audience. A profound, glacial calm settled over him. His entire demeanor shifted. The gentle, unassuming Al vanished, replaced by the commanding, powerful presence of Alistair Vance. He moved through the silent cafe, his steps measured and silent, but every eye was drawn to him. He was calm but powerful. He walked directly to Alara's side, placing a steadying hand on her arm. He didn't even glance at the mess on the floor. His unwavering eyes were fixed on Beatrice Thorne. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the room, cutting through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Beatrice, startled by the intervention of this handsome, well-dressed stranger, looked at him with haughty confusion. "I beg your pardon. Do I know you?" "You don't," Alistair replied, his voice still dangerously calm. "But I know you. I know you're the woman who threw this young mother and your own grandchild onto the street out of spite and bitterness." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Beatrice's face went white. This was not part of her script. "And I know," Alistair continued, his voice beginning to rise with a controlled, righteous anger, "that you stand here and speak of disgrace. You want to talk about disgrace?" He looked around the room, his commanding gaze meeting the eyes of every single patron. "Let me tell you about this woman you call a failure," his powerful monologue began. "A few weeks ago, I was in a park with my 5-year-old daughter. It was cold and raining, and my little girl was shivering. This woman, Alara, who I now know had nothing in the world but the clothes on her back and the baby in her arms, walked up to us. She took the only blanket she had for her own child and gave it to mine. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The silence was absolute. That single, selfless act showed more grace, more dignity, and more pure humanity than you, Mrs. Thorne, have displayed in your entire miserable, privileged life. He then delivered the final, devastating blow, the grand revelation. "My name is Alistair Vance." The name dropped into the room like a bomb. Recognition dawned on Beatrice's face, followed by sheer, unadulterated terror. Thorne Industries, her late husband's company, had been trying to secure a contract with Vance Global for years. "And as of this moment," Alistair said, pulling out his phone, "any and all business that Vance Global has pending with Thorne Industries is hereby terminated." He made a call, his words crisp and final. "David, cancel the Thorne contract. Effective immediately." He hung up. "You just cost your family's company a $50 million deal." He then turned to the stunned cafe owner. "I'm buying this building," he stated, not asked. "As of tomorrow, I will be your new landlord. And Alara's employment, and her salary, which we will now triple, are permanently secure." The power dynamic was completely, utterly reversed. He had publicly offered her protection and status. Beatrice stood speechless, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Her public triumph had turned into her own public, catastrophic humiliation. The savior had arrived. Alistair's hand never left Alara's arm. With a quiet authority that brooked no argument, he guided her through the stunned, silent crowd, away from the shattered porcelain and the ruins of Beatrice Thorne's arrogance. He led her out of the cafe and into the crisp autumn air, into the back of a sleek, black car that had appeared at the curb as if summoned by his very will. The door clicked shut, encasing them in a world of soft leather and profound, sterile silence. Alara was trembling, the adrenaline from the confrontation giving way to a deep, shuddering shock. She stared at him, at the man she knew as Al, the kind, grieving widower from the shelter, now sitting beside her in an impeccably tailored suit, emanating an aura of undeniable power. The whiplash of it was disorienting. She couldn't reconcile the two images. Alistair Vance, she whispered, the name feeling foreign and unreal on her tongue. The Alistair Vance. He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw not the commanding CEO, but a raw, tender vulnerability that was achingly familiar. It was the look of, Al, yes, he said, his voice quiet. I'm sorry, Elara. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid. The concept seemed absurd. What could a man like him possibly be afraid of? I was afraid of this, he gestured around the luxurious interior of the car. I was afraid you would see all of this before you saw me. The connection we made, in the shelter, in the cafe. It was real. It was the first real thing I've felt since my wife died. I didn't want to risk losing that. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to bridge the vast new chasm that had opened between them. When you gave Lily your blanket, he began, his voice thick with emotion, you did something no one in my world ever does. You gave without any thought of return. It was a miracle. It was like a light turning on in a dark room. You reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, still something worth fighting for. He leaned forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. I had my team find you. I arranged the room at the shelter. I wanted to help, but I didn't want to insult your dignity. I wanted to get to know the woman who performed such a beautiful, selfless act. The pieces clicked into place for Elara, the miraculous room, the job, Al's convenient appearances. It wasn't a series of happy coincidences, it was a quiet, deliberate web of protection he had woven around her. The shock began to recede, replaced by a wave of disbelief, and then, a slow dawning, overwhelming gratitude. He hadn't just saved her from Beatrice's cruelty, he had been saving her all along. The car pulled smoothly into the underground garage of a stately, ornate residential building. He led her to a private elevator and up to a sprawling penthouse apartment with breathtaking views of the city. It was beautiful, but it had the same sterile, unlived-in quality as his study had. It was a house, not a home. They stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights twinkling below them like a carpet of fallen stars. It was in this quiet, safe space that he finally laid his heart bare. You didn't just save my daughter from the cold that night, Elara, he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. You saved me. I was drowning in my own grief, a ghost in my own life. Your kindness was the hand that pulled me out of the water. It reawakened my heart. It gave me a reason to live again, a purpose beyond just existing. He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes searching hers for a sign, any sign, that he hadn't just destroyed everything between them. I know this is all too much, too fast. But what I feel for you has nothing to do with my name or my money. I'm falling in love with you, Elara. Not because I want to rescue you, but because your strength, your dignity, and your incredible heart have rescued me. His romantic declaration hung in the air, sincere and profound. Elara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the billionaire CEO. She saw the grieving husband, the worried father, the kind man who had listened to her story in a shelter kitchen and made her feel seen. He hadn't bought her affection, he had earned it with his quiet, steady presence and his profound empathy. Tears glistened in her eyes, but for the first time, they were tears of hope. Al, she whispered, using the name that felt most true. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken hope, the disbelief, the dawning affection, it was all there in her shimmering eyes. He gently closed the distance between them and, with a tenderness that felt sacred, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss not of passion, but of profound, cathartic release, a promise of a new beginning, a merging of two shattered souls finding wholeness in each other. Security and love. 1 year later. The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the large French doors, painting warm stripes across the polished hardwood floors of a home filled with life and laughter. This house was not the sterile penthouse, but a sprawling, comfortable home in the countryside, filled with soft rugs, overflowing bookshelves, and the happy clutter of a family. The air smelled of baking bread and fresh-cut flowers. In the lush green garden, Alastair was pushing a giggling Lily on a wooden swing, his face relaxed and open, the haunted shadows long since banished from his eyes. Nearby, Elara sat on a soft blanket spread on the grass, watching a now toddling Leo take a few wobbly steps before tumbling harmlessly onto the lawn, his delighted squeals filling the air. This was their perfect, idyllic life. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by a bond of profound love and mutual salvation. Elara, no longer the gaunt, desperate woman from the alleyway, was radiant. She ran a successful charitable foundation, funded by Alastair, that provided support and shelter for homeless families, her own experiences fueling a deep, unwavering passion to help others. She had found her purpose, not as a recipient of charity, but as a force for good in the world. Alastair had transformed as well. He had delegated much of the day-to-day running of his company, choosing instead to be a present father and a devoted partner. The light had returned to his life, brighter and warmer than before, reflected in the love he shared with Elara and the children. Hanging in a simple, elegant frame on the wall of their living room was the worn, faded blanket. It was their most prized possession, a sacred relic. It was a constant reminder of the cold night in the park that had changed everything, a symbol of the truth that the most powerful force in the universe is not wealth or status, but a simple, selfless act of human kindness. Elara watched as Alastair caught Leo in a hug, lifting him high into the air. The sound of their combined laughter was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Lily, who handed her a freshly picked daisy. Elara smiled, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She was home. She was loved. She was safe. Total silence, save for the sound of happiness. This story is a testament to the profound, almost magical power of a single act of kindness. It shows us how one selfless gesture, offered without any expectation of reward, can ripple outwards, transforming lives in the most unexpected and beautiful ways. Elara, at her lowest point, gave away the last thing she had, an act of pure empathy that broke through the walls of grief surrounding a man who had everything and nothing. Her quiet dignity in the face of unbearable hardship and his subsequent journey from cynical despair to renewed purpose is a fable for our times, reminding us that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the capacity of our hearts to give and to love. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the goodness of people, we hope you'll continue this journey with us. These narratives are more than just stories, they are reminders of the light that exists even in the darkest of times, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. The world can often feel cold and transactional, but as Elara and Alastair's journey shows, a moment of warmth and sincere connection can change the entire world for someone. For more soul-stirring and heartwarming stories like this one, please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue creating content that celebrates love, resilience, and the undeniable power of a compassionate heart. We'll see you in the next one.